and they failed. They thought that the social construction of reality was totally responsible for the gender roles that people had, and so they couldn't see why everyone couldn't do anything they wanted to be. Well, they came up against this wall that wouldn't let them do that all the way. And so they were very frustrated at that point. Then they moved into a third wave of feminism, and you ended up really with a bunch of writers who seemed to hate males. And that was pretty much the main dominant drive at that point in feminist studies, that they were literally angry about males, arguing that if only we had only women elected, we wouldn't have wars. If only we had women in charge of these things, we wouldn't have these masculine problems. And maybe we should try to change the way society is structured. So they started drugging very active males in schools by giving them drugs to try to feminize them, literally, so they weren't behaving the way males normally do, especially the super active males, the dominant ones, right? Drug them so that they can't cause these kinds of problems at recess, right? Right? Are you familiar with all this stuff, right? We have all kinds of drugs that were given to kids in order to change their behavior in school, so they would sit there and listen in class instead of be active, as young males tend to do, right? So I think there's still attempts to use drugs to accomplish that kind of thing. Well, it's Peter Berger. Fascinating. The Name Machine. So let me move on now to the person I was. I should do history and two other people, really, or at least one other person. That's Francis Fukuyama. So when we talk about identity and the impact of this kind of dialectical process, notice I don't know if it's his best known book, but The End of History and the Last Man, talking about the end of history. Hegel never actually said the end of history, but what he does talk about is the goal of history, and is the goal met by a society that becomes a liberal democracy. And the reason for that association is because Hegel argues that the goal of history is freedom. Notice, by the way, that the United States has pretty much adopted that as its understanding of the goal of history as well. Increase individual freedom and freedom for everyone, really, right? So this is Hegel. By the way, Hegel predicted that the next stage of history would happen in the United States. So he predicted that because of the changes going on in our society. But it's interesting to me, too, because this is also the goal of the universe. What is the goal of the universe? Entropy. What is entropy? More freedom, essentially, right? One of my most fascinating finds a few years ago was the book by Dorian Sagan. And yes, he's the son of Carl Sagan, if you were familiar with him. And it's Into the Cool. The interesting aspect of this is he's got lots of books out there, but Into the Cool is a book, notice, energy, flow, thermodynamics, life, how everything seems to be moving towards entropy, right? Absolutely fascinating, ties into this beautifully. And by the way, you think life fights entropy because it keeps trying to maintain itself, right? So we don't want to change too rapidly. We want our children to look like humans, right? We want them to look like people. We don't want them to look like robots with blue lights, especially, right? Or red lights, I'm sorry. The blue lights are good, the red lights are bad. But, you know, that was, what was that, iRobot or whatever, wherever that meme came from. But if you think about it, life fights against entropy. It tries to keep order, right? And entropy is breaking down order, right? Freedom is the opposite of order, right? You know, if everybody's all marching in a line, that's not freedom, right? So order is associated with non-freedom, and freedom is associated more and more with chaos, right? But life fights against chaos, and that's interesting. But as life progresses and gets more and more complex and creates things like human society, what does human society do? What does human society does? What do we do? Right? We create faster and faster use of resources. And as a result of that faster and faster use of resources, we create entropy faster. So we're keeping a particular type of order, but the complex order that we create actually increases entropy in the universe. Hence global warming and the possibility of destroying our biosphere so that we can no longer live in it. You know, we're transforming it so quickly. But Francis Fukuyama gives us a book called The End of History, which argues that, and that came out, by the way, as the Soviet Union collapsed, and basically he was arguing the goal of history is freedom, and what's going to happen is that societies now will have to be liberal, capitalistic democracies, right? You're going to have really a society based on the model of the United States and some European countries. You know, that's the way societies are going to have to be. Have they all gone that way? They actually have recurred as totalitarian in a lot of them now. There's kind of an interesting regression away from this kind of society, and there's people arguing over why is that the case? Is it because people are afraid of the complexity in those kinds of societies that they'd rather go for a totalitarian leader instead of remaining a liberal democracy, right? You've got some interesting fights over that. But he's also written about identity and how that works, and it's absolutely excellent. His books, by the way, are also written by a team. He usually has a whole team of people working on his books so that you could tell political order, current views. I think I could show you his book on identity. Look at all this stuff. I haven't read this lately. A Russian defeat will make possible a new birth of freedom. Drones will become increasingly critical in the battlefield. So this is absolutely interesting stuff. Identity. So there you go. Hegel's philosophy is still today a very contemporary issue, and how the issue of identity is of concern. Okay, I've got to stop and move on to John Stuart Mill, and I've got these reversed here. There we go. So John Stuart Mill. Where is John Stuart Mill from? His family, his father is James Mill, was a friend with Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham didn't invent the word utility or utilitarian, but he codified it by grouping all of the different things that are associated with the philosophy of utilitarianism and putting them together. Think of him as a quantitative hedonist. Quantitative hedonist, because he believes that the greatest good for the greatest number, should be our highest ethical principle. Why is this a concern? Well, notice that society is progressing along with this Hegelian model. You see it applied not only to things like biology, with Charles Darwin, right? 1859, Charles Darwin, remember 1807 is when the Phenomenology of Mind comes out, so you can see that it's taken roughly 50 years to spread and influence everyone. It's a paradigm shift, what we call a paradigm shift. We're no longer thinking in terms of a mechanical clock-like universe. Was that an earthquake? Oh well, it's over. Sorry. We have them, you know. You've heard of them? Taiwan just had one, 7.5.
7.5. Yeah, I saw on a Reddit.
Yeah, 7.5 yesterday. Taiwan. Coolest building I've ever seen. Did you see that picture of that building?
Like the one.
Yeah, I don't know how you go to the bathroom in that building on the top floor. It's gravity would. Well, let's not go there. Totally. That's actually a very serious thing. What, 4 people died so far? 9? Getting worse. Oh well. His principle, the greatest good for the greatest number, is a utilitarian response to the progression of ethics. Remember, we think, you know, that shoot, when Achilles was out there killing everybody and everybody thought he was their hero, the ethical thing to do was to be a big brute and kill anybody you wanted. By the time we get to Plato and then Aristotle, we have some sort of ethical system that seems closer to what we think of ourselves today. And clearly ethics has evolved, become, as Hegel would describe it, over time and gotten better. Don't we think it's better? Won't you rather live in the United States than... Well, I mean, lots of people vote with their feet to come live in the United States. That's pretty clear. So arguably, our way of life, our system of ethics has progressed. And that means that the social construction of reality has taken this dialectical process and at each step of the way, as Hegel says, advanced freedom. You know, this process, now there are famous expressions for the opposite. I remember Lenin, for example, wrote a book, Shag Vperyod, Dva Shaga Nazad, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, which I think that's pretty dumb. You don't want to go that way, right? But the idea of it, of course, is that sometimes this dialectical process goes in reverse, you know. But normally, even if we're looking at, say, a pendulum swing from a liberal form of leadership to a conservative form of leadership, and then maybe go back to a liberal, you know, you look at the way our election process has worked, right? Obama is president, and the reaction to that pendulum is, you know, way over here on, well, it wasn't that liberal. Reagan was actually, in some sense, more liberal. Nixon was even more liberal. But if you look at the way that pendulum swung, it resulted in, who's that guy with the blonde hair and the red tie? You know, that guy, you know, happened. And that pendulum then swung back, and we have Biden, right? You know, so there's this pendulum. Is the pendulum swing going back and forth actually moving us in some direction towards freedom, Hegel said? Pardon?
The Overton window?
Overton window.
Because the pendulum's fixture point itself moves to either direction as well, even though it's swaying. And so each time it swings, it's encompassing like new space, or reverting back to old space?
I'm not,
Of what's socially acceptable,
yeah,
I guess.
yeah.
Not really related.
As a progressive, I think,
Mechanism.
well, we clearly have more rights, so-called, than they did at the dawn of our experiment, right? United States, right? Medical rights. Do we have medical rights? Do we have rights for animals? So,